Have you ever heard a knock on your door late at night? You peek through the window expecting a neighbour or maybe someone lost, but instead you see a child. They ask to come inside. They speak in a strange, flat voice. And when they look up at you, their eyes are nothing but pitch black pools, empty of any emotion, like something wearing a child's skin. People say once you notice those eyes, everything in you knows to slam the door. So pour a drink, double check those locks, and let's get into it. Hey Night Owls, and welcome back to another episode of Midnight Mysteries. I'm your host, Shaylin Jade, and tonight we're exploring the stories of the black-eyed kids. Are they urban myth, aliens, demons, or something else entirely? These sightings keep popping up all over the world, and tonight we're going to pull back the curtains on their origins, the encounters, and the dark theories that surround them. Make sure you stick around to the end because after we investigate these black-eyed children, we dive into our weekly Night Owl narrative where I share a chilling story that I received in my emails. So if you have your own brush with the paranormal or the unexplained, feel free to send your stories to midnightmysteriespodcast@outlook.com and you'll have the chance at being featured on a future Night Owl narrative segment. Alright, let's get into where this whole unsettling legend really began. The term black-eyed children actually gained traction back in the late 1990s, when a journalist named Brian Bethel shared a chilling story of his own. Back in 1996, Brian was sitting in his car, parked outside a movie theatre, writing out a check. It was after dark, but not terribly late, and the area was lit by the glow of streetlights. He'd been focused on his paperwork when out of nowhere there was a knock on the driver's side window. Two boys were standing there, around 12, maybe 13 years old. They looked pretty average at first glance. One wore a hooded sweatshirt, the other had pale skin and dark hair. Nothing obviously threatening. But Brian said something about their presence immediately felt off. The boys spoke calmly, even politely. They wanted a ride. They told him they were going to see a movie but had forgotten their money at home. Could he drive them back to get it? They promised it wouldn't take long. Brian described this strange sense of pressure in the air. He felt afraid, but he couldn't say why. As he listened, something in their tone set off every alarm bell in his head. Their speech was so practiced, polite, but hollow. Like they knew the lines, but they didn't understand them. They kept repeating the same phrases. It won't take long. We can't come in unless you say it's okay. Brian glanced back at them, and that's when he really saw it. Their eyes were completely black. No whites, no irises. He described a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, as if he let them in, something truly terrible would happen. It was primal, like every survival instinct kicked in at once. He refused, fumbled for his keys. The boys grew more insistent, their tone sharper. But Brian started the engine and peeled out of there with his heart pounding. Later he shared the encounter online, partly to make sense of it, partly to warn others. And what he didn't expect was his story would go viral. Emails and messages poured in. People from all over the world claiming they'd seen the same eerie children. Black eyes, monotone voices, a weird sense of forced politeness, and that same bone-deep fear. Brian's post became the match that lit a fire, and suddenly the black-eyed children weren't just a personal nightmare anymore. And that's what we're going to keep unpacking tonight. Where did these kids come from? Why do so many people report them? And most unsettling of all, what do they really want? So let's look closer at what makes these black-eyed children encounters so consistent and so chilling. First off, there's the pattern. Nearly every report has these eerie similarities. Usually starts the same way. Someone alone, often at night, maybe parked somewhere, maybe home alone, a knock at the door or on a car window, two children, sometimes more but most often two. They always seem normal at first glance. Modest clothes, pale skin, sometimes a hoodie pulled over. They speak in a calm, even friendly voice, asking to come inside or asking for a ride. Their stories are simple. We need to use your phone. We forgot our money. Let us in. But something is always off. The way they talk feels rehearsed, almost robotic, like they're mimicking what they think a child should say. And then there's the strangest part of all. They never come straight in. They always ask permission. And then, of course, the detail that gives them their name. Their eyes. Pitch black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye. People say the second they spot those eyes, they're hit with a wave of terror. Sometimes it's a chill, sometimes full-on panic. But nearly everyone reports a sense that if they allow these kids inside, something horrific will happen. What's wild is how widespread these stories have become. From small towns in Texas to suburbs in the UK to remote highways here in Australia. And here's the kicker. The kids never seem to age. Reports from the 90s to now still talk about 10 to 13-year-olds. So what are they? Ghosts? Demons? Alien human hybrids? Or something else entirely? But first, I want to share a couple more real stories from people who claim to have crossed paths with these kids. Because no matter how much you try to rationalize it, these encounters leave a mark. The kind that keeps you up at night. Second guessing every knock at your door. One of the most wildly shared cases comes from a man named Chris, who lived in a rural part of Vermont. It was winter, late one evening, and snow was piling up outside. He heard a loud knock at the front door, and when he opened it, two children stood on the porch, a boy and a girl, around 10 years old. They wore outdated clothes, like they'd stepped out from another decade. No coats, even though it was freezing. The boy asked politely, "May we come in? Our parents will be here soon." When he glanced at their faces properly, that's when he saw the pitch black eyes. Every instinct in his body told him to slam the door, but he hesitated for a moment, trying to reason with himself. That's when the girl repeated, "We can't come in unless you invite us." He shut the door, locked it, and backed away. Through the peephole, he saw them just standing there in the snow, still waiting. And then a few minutes later, they were gone. No footprints in the snow at all. Or there's the story of Emily, a young woman in London who was riding home on the night bus. Two kids climbed aboard at a random stop, no parents, no money, and sat down directly across from her. They stared at her until she looked up. Then they asked in perfect unison, "May we come home with you?" She said their voices were flat, unnatural, and their eyes were pure black. The bus driver even noticed and told them to get off if they didn't have a ticket. They obeyed, but just before stepping off, One turned back and told Emily, "It's better if you never invite us." Emily said she couldn't sleep for weeks after that. And then there's one more encounter that I can't leave out. It comes from a man named Richard, who was working late in his office one night in rural Oregon. It was about 11:30 p.m. when he noticed two kids standing under the street lamp just outside the building. Just standing there, staring up at his window. At first he thought maybe they were lost, so he went downstairs to check. But as he stepped out into the hallway, they were suddenly right at the glass front doors. They knocked. Richard said the knock was slow, deliberate, and somehow too strong for kids that size. He asked if they needed help, but they wouldn't answer. They just kept knocking, until finally the boy spoke. "Please let us in, we have to use the phone." Richard told them no, he would call the police instead, but the girl stepped forward, close enough to the glass that he could see her eyes. Solid black. He backed away, locked the interior office door and hid up in the break room until morning. When security came to open up, there was no sign of the children. No footprints, no record of them on security cameras, nothing. Richard quit that job a month later. There are hundreds of stories like these, all different places, all different times, but always the same. Alright, next we're going to dive into the theories, because there are plenty, and see if we can make sense of who or what these children might actually be. It's one thing to hear these stories, but trying to actually explain them, that's where things get really interesting. Because the black-eyed children legend, well, it's sparked a whole range of theories. Some think these kids are modern urban legends, basically campfire tales that got a bit out of control thanks to the internet. But then you get the people who swear up and down that they really saw them, and they lean into other explanations. Some think the kids are extraterrestrial, that their solid black eyes are a biological feature or even a disguise to hide what they really are. Others push the idea that they're demonic, that these children are a sort of harbinger or a vessel, sent to test people or to cross some kind of spiritual threshold, which is why they always need to ask permission to come inside. There's also a theory that these kids are interdimensional, that they slip through thin spots in our world, crossing over just long enough to terrify someone and then vanish without a trace, like they're only partially real, glitching between realities. Of course, skeptics are quick to say none of this is true, that it's just a psychological phenomenon, people scaring themselves in the dark, pattern matching kids acting weird and turning a mundane moment into a horror story. But with so many of these stories repeating the same eerie details all over the world, it kind of makes you wonder if something else is going on. Think about how these encounters usually start. Someone is alone, maybe tired, it's late, and there's a knock at the door. That's the moment when you're most vulnerable. And that's when they show up, asking to be let in. It's such a violation of what we think of as a safe place, your home, your car, or even your work. The idea that they need permission taps into ancient vampire and demon folklore. So in a way, the Black-Eyed Kids legend combines all of the scariest elements at once. They look almost human, they arrive at night, and they push for you to break your own instincts and invite them in. That's why these stories seem to stick in your head, because they're perfectly engineered to hit every nerve of primal fear that we've got. So let's talk about how the Black-Eyed Children went from a handful of unsettling stories to a full-on modern legend. Back in the late 1990s, there were only a few scattered encounters like Brian's. But once the stories hit message boards and forums, people couldn't get enough. The thing is, the more these tales circulated, the more people came forward with their own experiences. And it's hard to know if that means there were more black-eyed children appearing, or if people were just primed to see them. That's the tricky part about folklore in the age of social media. Stories spread and then shape new stories in a kind of echo chamber. You'd see photos online claiming to capture a black-eyed child. Video recreations popped up. Even TV shows started dramatizing the stories, blending fact and fiction so thoroughly it was impossible to separate one from the other. And the mystery only deepened because these encounters weren't happening in one place. They showed up in the US, the UK, Australia, even Japan. Always the same script, the same polite kids, and the same black eyes. Whether that's proof of something real or just a modern urban myth that people bought into, that's up to you. Some people believe these stories are a warning, a kind of cultural mirror that reflects our fears about strangers, lost innocence, or the vulnerability we feel answering the door at night. Maybe the kids are just the latest face of something much older. Or maybe they're exactly what they seem to be. A modern paranormal phenomenon that we haven't fully understood yet. Okay, now let's dive into our weekly Night Owl narrative. This week we hear a story from Lincoln, who has a lifelong fascination with an old asylum, until something reached out, quite literally, during one of his visits. Lincoln says, "So I have been interested in old buildings since I was about 10 years old. This started when my parents took me for a ghost tour in one of the largest old asylums of the Southern Hemisphere. But I didn't see anything out of the ordinary until about 15 years old. I was a frequent visitor of this asylum as I wanted to know everything about it. The people who now owned this old building knew my face well. Anyway, on this particular tour, we started off at the very front. It only took 15 minutes for something bizarre to occur. I was standing at the back of the group while the tour guide was telling the story of how one of the old owners of the asylum, during its open days, had killed himself in the very room we were standing in. Right as the guide mentioned this, a man a few feet in front of me yelled out in pain. Everybody looked at him. The tour guide stopped what they were saying to try and find out more about the reason for the cry of pain. The man had explained that someone touched his back. Not just touched, but scratched. I was confused. The only person behind him was me, and I saw nothing. The tour guide asked him, "Could we please see your back?" His girlfriend lifted his shirt, and just like he said, there was a scratch mark. But not a normal mark. 3 long, sharp nail marks opened his skin. There was a small amount of blood flowing from the fresh wound. The guide then explained that this happens quite often here, but had never seen a scratch that deep before. 45 minutes later, we were in the infirmary. I knew the history of this particular building. This is where patients would be treated for physical illnesses rather than mental illness. This building was very spiritually active according to what I've heard from the guides. And honestly, what I'm about to tell you didn't really surprise me at the time until I got more context. But let me just tell you the story. Once again, I was at the back. Not all the way, but there were maybe 2 or 3 people behind me. And the guide was talking about their method of surgery. Here's a little history lesson. This particular asylum opened in 1865. And if you know anything about the history of anesthesia, you'd know that modern anesthesia didn't exist until the 1930s. So what did they do instead? Rock salt in the eyes. The idea was that the pain of rock salt in the eyes would distract the patient enough so that any other pains went unrecognized. This is a little insight to how bad the medical knowledge at that time was, let alone how mistreated the mentally unwell were. The tour guide was telling the story to the group. I'd heard it before, but as always, I cringed at the details, imagining how awful it would be. all of a sudden, a teenage boy further ahead from me collapsed. He had passed out. As I mentioned earlier, this didn't surprise me much. It was a gory tale. He was probably squeamish. But here's the part that shook me. When he had regained consciousness, the guide was asking him if he passed out because of the story. He said he didn't. He said that blood and stories of such didn't really bother him at all. The tour guide looked at him unusually confused. This was out of character for the tour guide because they are expected to know the answer to everything about the asylum, including the occasional faint or mishap. The guide asked the question we all wanted to know the answer to. So, what happened? The guide asked the boy. Well, I guess I fainted at the same time I saw the man dressed up as the doctor. There wasn't a man dressed up like a doctor. Well, Lincoln, you sure have a way of ending a story. It's one thing to hear unsettling history, but to have someone react to it in real time? I appreciate you taking us there with such detail. If you've enjoyed this episode of Midnight Mysteries, I'd love it if you could take a moment to follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast app. And if you're feeling generous, leaving a rating or review really helps more than you know. Next time on Midnight Mysteries, we're heading to California and stepping inside one of the strangest mansions in the world. A place where the walls shift, the staircases lead to nowhere, and the woman behind it all may have been guided by ghosts. Join me as we explore the twisting halls and chilling legends of the Winchester Mystery House. Until then, good night, night owls, and sweet dreams.